Welcome to the UiPath Studio Deep Dive. Today, we're going to tackle some really foundational concepts, things you absolutely need for managing information in your automation projects. We're talking variables, constants, and arguments.
That's right. These are, well, they're like the essential tools, aren't they? They let your digital workflows actually handle and move data around effectively.
Exactly. And our goal today is pretty straightforward. Give everyone a clear, practical understanding of these core elements.
Yeah, so you can build robust automations without, getting bogged down in the nitty-gritty too early.
We'll look at what they are, how they work, and importantly, how they kind of fit together in UiPath Studio.
Building that solid base. When you're creating automations, you're really just setting up steps to manipulate data. And variables, constants, arguments, they're the mechanics behind it all.
Get these right, and you've got much better control.
Absolutely. A stronger command over what you can actually build.
Okay, let's dive right in then. Variables. Now, for someone maybe just starting out with UiPath Studio, variable might sound a bit technical. Can you break it down? What is a variable in this context?
Sure. Imagine you have a little labeled box, a container. And this box, it can temporarily hold different kinds of information. Could be text, could be a number, maybe a true-false value, even a whole table of data.
Okay, a temporary box.
Yeah, and the key thing, the really crucial part in UiPath, is that the information inside that box can change while your automation is running.
Ah, so it's not fixed.
Not at all. It's dynamic. It's like the automation's short-term memory, letting it adapt to different situations as they happen.
Okay, that makes sense. So why is having these changeable labeled boxes so critical when building automations? What's the practical benefit?
Well, their real power, I think, comes from letting the automation work with information it doesn't know beforehand. Dynamic information.
Right, like user input.
Exactly. Say your automation needs to ask a user for an order number. You can't just type that number into the automation itself because it'll be different every single time.
Right, yeah.
So you use a variable to store whatever the user types in. Then your automation can take that stored order number and use it later on. Maybe look up details, update a system, whatever it needs to do.
Okay. So it's all about handling that real-time dynamic data.
Precisely.
It's kind of like having a temporary notepad, isn't it? You jot down info you'll need to refer back to during the process.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
A temporary notepad.
So how do we actually get these notepads, these variables, into our UiPath automation? And what if we make too many? Can we get rid of them?
Yeah, creating them is pretty straightforward, actually. There's a couple of main ways. When you're using an activity, especially one that, spits out some data.
An output.
Yeah, an output. You'll see an output field in its properties pane, usually on the right. UiPath then prompts you to name your new variable, and it sets it up to store that output.
Convenient. And the other way?
The other main way is using the variables pane. It's usually docked at the bottom of the Studio window. In that pane, you can manually create variables from scratch. You define the name, the type of data it will hold, the works.
Got it. Now, what about cleaning up? Sometimes you build something complex, try a few things. You might end up with variables you don't actually need anymore.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's definitely good practice to keep your project tidy. Clutter can get confusing. So in that same variables pane, you can just find the variable you don't need, right-click on it, and select delete. Simple as that.
Okay, manual deletion.
But there's also a really handy automated feature. If you go to the Design tab in the main ribbon at the top, there's an option called Remove Unused Variables. You click that, and Studio scans your entire workflow and just gets rid of any variables that aren't actually being used by any activities.
Oh, that's brilliant. A one-click cleanup.
Yeah, it's great for streamlining things, especially in larger projects.
Definitely sounds useful. Now, when you create a variable, I've noticed it doesn't seem like you can just use it anywhere in your automation. I've heard the term scope. What does the scope of a variable actually mean?
Scope.
Right.
Scope essentially defines the boundaries, where within your automation, a specific variable is actually visible and usable. Think of it like containers nested inside each other.
Okay.
If you create a variable inside, say, a specific sequence activity, then typically that variable can only be used within that sequence, or within activities nested deeper inside it.
So it wouldn't be available in a totally separate sequence?
Generally, no. Not unless that separate sequence is somehow nested inside the first one. The scope is usually determined by the smallest container. Could be an activity block, like a for each, a sequence, or even the entire workflow file where you initially created the variable.
So if I make a variable inside of for each loop, its reach, its scope might just be limited to the stuff happening inside that loop.
Exactly. And that controlled access is actually really important.
Why is that?
It helps keep your automation organized. It prevents unintended side effects where maybe one part of your process accidentally messes with the data used by a completely different part. Keeps things contained.
Right, prevents accidental overwrites or confusion.
Precisely. And you can usually see and sometimes adjust the scope for each variable right there in the variables pane. It tells you which container defines its scope.
Okay, that clarifies scope. I also noticed when creating a variable, there's an option for a default value. When would setting a default value be useful?
Ah, yes, default values.
Hmm.
Setting one gives your variable an initial value right when the automation starts, even before any activity explicitly assigns something else to it.
So it starts with something known.
Exactly. And that can be helpful for a few reasons. Like, if you have a counter variable you plan to increase in a loop, you'd probably want to set its default value to 0. Or maybe you have a true-false variable, a Boolean, that tracks if something's been done. You might start it off as false.
I see. So it makes the starting state predictable.
Right. It makes behavior more predictable, and it can also help avoid errors, if you accidentally try to use a variable before anything has actually put no value into it.
That makes a lot of sense. Avoid those object reference, not set errors, perhaps.
Exactly those kinds.
Okay, so variables are these containers with a name, a scope defining where they work, and maybe an optional starting value. But what kind of stuff can you actually put in these containers? That brings us to the different types of variables, doesn't it?
It does. And UiPath supports quite a range of data types to handle different kinds of information. Probably the most common, the most fundamental, is the text variable. You'll see it referred to as string.
String.
It's just for storing any sequence of characters, words, sentences, names, addresses, product codes, basically any text data you might encounter.
So that customer name or order number we talked about earlier, that would likely be a string variable.
Almost certainly, yes.
Yeah.
Then you have true-false variables, technically called Booleans.
Booleans, true or false.
Yet they can only hold one of those two values, true or false. Super useful for decision-making logic.
Like checking if a file exists.
Perfect example. Does the file exist?
Yeah.
True, false. Has the login succeeded? True or false? That kind of thing drives the flow and if activities.
Makes sense. Binary choices. What about numbers?
For whole numbers, integers, you'll very commonly use number variables, specifically the type called int32.
Int32? Okay, that's specific.
Again, it's for a 32-bit integer. It handles whole numbers, positive or negative, within a certain range. If you need decimals, there are other types like double, but int32 is your go-to for counting things, using indexes, basic integer math.
So text, true, false, whole numbers, that covers a lot. What if you need to handle like a list of things?
Collections. That's where array variables come in. An array is basically an ordered collection of items, and this is important, they all have to be of the same data type.
All the same type.
Like you could have an array of integers, maybe int32, that's how you often see it written, with the square brackets.
Right.
That could hold a list of employee IDs. Or an array of strings, string, to hold a list of file paths you need to process. Think of it like a numbered list where each item has a specific position or index.
Like my shopping list, where each item is text, a string, and they're all grouped together.
Exactly like that. And
Oh.
sometimes you need to work specifically with dates and times.
Oh yeah, scheduling or logging.
Right. For that, UiPath provides date and time variables. The type is called datetime. These let you store specific points in time, calculate differences between dates, format them nicely. Very useful.
Essential for anything time sensitive, I imagine. Now, what about more structured data, like data you'd find in an Excel sheet or maybe a database table, rows and columns?
Excellent question. For that kind of structured tabular data, UiPath has a very powerful type. Data table variables or simply data table.
A table, okay.
This lets you store and manipulate data in rows and columns, just like a spreadsheet or a database table, but right there in your automation's memory. So when you're, say, reading a CSV file or scraping a table from a website, that data often gets neatly packaged into a data table variable.
So a data table is like a variable that holds a mini database table inside it. That sounds incredibly useful.
It is very versatile for dealing with structured information.
Okay. I think there's one more type that sometimes pops up. Generic variables, sometimes called object. What's the deal with those?
Generic or object variables. They're very flexible because they can technically store almost any type of data.
Sounds great.
Well, yes and no. That flexibility comes at a price. When you actually want to use the data stored inside a generic variable, you almost always need to explicitly tell UiPath what type it really is. You need to convert it.
Ah, so you have to do an extra step.
Often, yes. It's like having a box that can hold anything, but before you use what's inside, you have to figure out and declare, okay, this is actually a number, or this is actually text. They can be useful in some advanced situations, or maybe if you truly don't know what type of data you'll receive. But generally, it's better practice to use the specific variable types whenever you can. It makes your automation clearer and easier to work with, avoids potential confusion or runtime errors.
Be specific if you can. That makes sense. Avoid those conversion headaches later.
Exactly.
Okay, so now I've got a good handle on what variables are and the different flavors they come in. Let's maybe look at some real-world examples. How do you actually use these variable types in typical UiPath activities?
Good idea. Let's start simple. Getting input from a user. You'd probably use the input dialog activity. It pops up a window, asks the user for something, maybe their name, or like we said, an employee ID.
Right.
The text the user types into that box, you can directly store that in a string variable. You just tell the input dialog activity in its output property, put the result in this string variable.
Simple enough. Capture user text into a text variable. What about doing something with numbers?
You use the assign activity a lot. It's kind of the workhorse for setting or changing a variable's value.
Assign.
Got it. For example, maybe you need to know how many files are in a folder or how many rows are in that data table we mentioned. You could use an expression, maybe something like directory.getFiles, see my folder count, or my datatable.rows.count. You put that expression in the value part of the assign activity and tell it to store the result in a number variable, an entity too.
Ah, so you calculate or find a value and assign it to store it numerically. Makes sense. And those data tables, how are they used once you have data in them?
Well, often, after you've scraped data from a web page using UiPath's tools, it lands in a data table variable automatically.
Okay.
Then, there are tons of activities designed specifically to work with data labels. Activities to filter rows based on criteria, sort the data, loop through each row individually, maybe write the whole table to an Excel file. Lots of possibilities.
So the data table becomes the input for other activities.
Exactly. And what about those true-false Booleans? Where do they fit in?
Good question. A really common place is inside an if activity. The if activity lets your automation make a decision.
Let's say you have a number variable counting login attempts.
Mm-hmm.
You could use an if condition, like login attempts 3. That comparison is the number greater than 3, results in either true or false. You could even store that true-false results itself in a Boolean variable if you wanted. But the if activity uses that true-false outcome to decide which path to take next, the then branch or the else branch.
So the Boolean value, whether direct or stored in a variable, acts like a switch for the automation's flow.
Precisely. A logical flag. Now, how about those array variables, the lists?
Right, the collections.
You'll often see array variables paired with the key figure for each activity. Imagine you have a list of email addresses stored in a string array variable.
Okay, an array of text.
You could then use a key figure for each activity. You tell it for each item in this email address array. And then inside the loop, you put the activities to perform on each individual email address one by one, like sending a personalized email to each address in the list.
Ah, so for each loop just iterates. It steps through every single element inside that array variable.
Exactly. It processes each item in the collection.
And we also touched on using number variables as counters in loops. How does that usually look?
Yeah, you see that a lot with while loops and do while loops. Typically, you'd initialize a number variable, maybe call it counter, setting its default value to 0 before the loop starts.
You start at 0.
Then somewhere inside the loop, you'd use an assign activity to increment that counter. Usually just counter plus 1.
Add 1 each time through.
Right. And the loop itself keeps running as long as some condition involving that counter is met, like counter 10 or counter max attempts. The number variable tracks how many times the loop is run.
Got it. The number variable controls the loop's duration or progress.
Yeah.
And finally, you mentioned the switch activity with number variables. How does that work?
The switch activity is like a more advanced if. It lets you choose one path out of many possible paths based on the value of some expression. Often that expression is just a number variable. For instance, maybe you ask the user to choose an option from a menu. Press 1 for A, 2 for B, 3 for C.
Classic menu choice.
You store their choice, 1, 2, or 3, in a number variable. Then the switch activity looks at the value of that variable. If it's 1, it executes case 1's activities. If it's 2, it executes case 2's activities, and so on.
So the number variable acts as the selector, telling the switch which block of actions to run.
Exactly. It directs the flow to the right case.
These examples really paint a picture. Variables are clearly fundamental for making automations flexible and, well, useful.
They really are the building blocks for handling changing data.
Now, before we shift gears fully to arguments, we briefly mentioned constants. They weren't a huge focus in the source info, but just to be clear, how do they fit in relative to variables?
Good point. It's a useful distinction. While variables, as we've seen, are all about holding data that can change during the automation's run, constants are the opposite. They hold values that you set once and they do not change. They stay fixed for the entire execution.
Fixed values? Like what?
Think of things like maybe a specific file path to an application that your automation always uses, or a fixed tax rate percentage, or maybe a URL for a system it logs into. Things that are part of the configuration but won't change mid-process.
Okay, unchanging settings or references.
Exactly. The sources also mention global constants, which suggests these are constants accessible from anywhere in the whole project. So while variables give you dynamic storage, constants give you reliable, unchanging reference points, which would be really good for making your automation easier to maintain. If that application path ever changes, you just update the constant in one place, not everywhere it might be used.
Ah, that's the key benefit. Centralized fixed values. Okay, that makes sense. Constants fixed, variables changeable.
Pretty much sums it up.
All right, let's switch focus properly now to arguments. We know what variables do within a workflow. How do arguments differ?
The main difference, the core distinction, is really about purpose and scope, but on a larger scale than variable scope. Variables, as we said, are mostly for passing data around inside a single workflow file. .saml.
Within one file.
Right. Arguments, on the other hand, are specifically designed for passing data between different workflow files. Think about building reusable pieces of automation. Maybe you have a main process, and it needs to call a separate, smaller workflow file to perform a specific task, like logging into an application.
Okay, modular design.
Exactly. Arguments are the communication channels you use to send information into that login workflow, like the username and password, and maybe get information back out, like whether the login was successful.
So arguments bridge the gap between separate automation files.
That's the key idea. They facilitate communication between workflows.
And I understand arguments have something variables don't.
A specific direction? What are these directions all about? Yes, direction is crucial for arguments. It defines how the data flows. Is it coming in, going out, or both? There are three main directions you'll work with: in, out, and in-out.
Okay, let's take them one by one. What does an in argument do?
An in argument is for receiving data into the workflow where it's defined. When a calling workflow, the one doing the invoking, starts this workflow, it can pass a value to this in argument.
So it's like an input parameter.
Exactly like an input parameter. Inside the current workflow, you can read and use the value of that in argument. But, and this is key, you can't change its value in a way that affects the original variable back in the calling workflow. It's read-only from the perspective of sending data back. You get the data, you use it, that's it.
Okay, in brings data into the workflow. So logically, out must do the opposite.
Precisely. An out argument is for passing data out of the current workflow, back to the workflow they called it. You'll typically assign a value to the out argument within the current workflow, maybe the result of a calculation or some status information. When this workflow finishes, the final value held by that out argument is then passed back and becomes available to the calling workflow. It's like a return value from a function.
So if my login workflow needs to tell the main process whether it succeeded or failed, it could set an out argument, maybe a Boolean, to true or false.
That's a perfect use case for an out argument. Exactly.
Okay, in for input, out for output. That leaves in out. Sounds like it does both.
It does. An in-out argument acts as both an input and a potential output. It can receive an initial value from the calling workflow, just like an in argument.
Right.
But crucially, you can also modify the value of that in-out argument within the current workflow. And when the workflow finishes, that potentially changed value is passed back to the calling workflow, updating the variable that was originally passed in.
Ah, so you pass something in, maybe work on it or update it, and then send the updated version back.
Exactly. It's useful if you need to, say, pass in a data object, modify some of its properties within the sub-workflow, and have those modifications reflected back in the main process.
Okay. In, out, and in-out. Those cover the main flows. I think I might have seen something called property direction mentioned somewhere too. What's that?
Yeah, property direction is a bit less common in everyday use. It essentially marks an argument that's defined in the workflow signature, but isn't actively being used for data transfer right now.
Like, it exists, but it's not connected.
Kind of. It's like a parameter definition that's just sitting there. Maybe it was used in a previous version, or maybe you're planning to use it later but haven't hooked it up yet. It indicates the argument is part of the workflow's definition, but isn't currently involved in the in, out, or in-out data exchange when invoked.
So sort of a placeholder, or maybe a remnant. Good to know it exists, even if it's less common.
Right. Mostly you'll focus on in-out and in-out.
Now, just like variables have the variables pane, how do you actually create and manage these arguments in UiPath Studio?
There's a dedicated arguments panel. You'll usually find it docked right next to the variables panel, typically at the bottom of the Studio interface.
Okay, arguments panel. Makes sense.
And in that panel, it's very similar to the variables pane. You can create new arguments, give them meaningful names, choose their data type string, in32, Boolean, data table, whatever you need. And most importantly, you select their direction, in, out, or in, out. That's where you define how each argument will behave in terms of data flow.
So it's the central place to define the contract, the data interface, for your reusable workflow pieces.
Well put. It defines the contract for how data gets in and out.
And how do you actually use these defined arguments? When you want one workflow to call another one and pass the data?
The key activity for this is called invoke workflow file.
Invoke workflow file. Pretty descriptive.
It is. You add this activity to your main workflow. Then you tell it which other workflow file, .yaml, you want to run.
Right.
As soon as you select the target workflow file, the properties pane for the invoke workflow file activity updates. It will show you a button or link, often labeled import arguments or similar. When you click that, it reads the arguments defined in the target workflow.
It reads the contract.
Exactly. And it displays fields for each of those in-out and in-out arguments. Then, right there in the properties, you connect them. For an in argument called workflow, you specify which variable in your current workflow holds the data you want to pass in.
Okay. Linking a local variable to the input argument.
Yep. And for an out or in-out argument coming back from the call workflow, you specify which variable in your current workflow should receive that return value.
Linking a local variable to capture the output.
Precisely. So the invoke workflow file activity is the bridge. And the arguments, configured with their directions and linked to local variables, are the pipes that let the data flow correctly between the two workflows.
That really clarifies how you build those modular, reusable automation components. You define the inputs and outputs with arguments, and then you connect them using invoke workflow file.
Exactly. And using arguments properly with the right directions is absolutely key to building solutions that are easier to understand, easier to test, and much easier to maintain and scale up later on. It promotes that clean, modular design.
Okay, wow. We've definitely covered a lot of ground there, from the basics of variables to the communication power of arguments. To make sure this all sticks, let's maybe just quickly recap the main takeaways. What are the absolute key differences and purposes?
Sounds good. So the big takeaway for variables, they are your go-to tool for storing and manipulating data within a single automation workflow file. Remember, they have a scope where they live and a data type, what kind of data they hold. They handle the internal data management.
Internal data management, got it. And arguments.
Arguments are different. Their job is specifically passing data between different automation workflow files. They are the bridges. And their direction in, out, or in, out is critical because it defines precisely how that data flows across the bridge between the calling workflow and the one being called.
Between workflows, okay.
And really understanding how to use both variables and arguments effectively is just, well, it's fundamental. You need them to build anything beyond the simplest automation. They let you create modular, reusable pieces and manage how information moves around.
Absolutely. It seems like mastering these is crucial for creating more complex and, importantly, well-organized automations in UiPath Studio.
Couldn't agree more. They allow for that complexity while maintaining clarity.
So for everyone listening, as you continue your journey with UiPath Studio, whether you're just starting or looking to improve, really keep these concepts in mind. Variables for inside a process, arguments for communication between processes.
Yeah, we've dug into the basics today, the core concepts in this deep dive. Hopefully it's provided a clearer picture of these really essential tools. As you get hands-on in Studio, really pay attention to how you're creating variables, how you're managing their scope, what types you're using. And when you start linking workflows, think carefully about those argument directions. They really are the building blocks.
Wouldn't have said it better. They're the building blocks for robust and efficient automation. And of course, for anyone wanting to dive even deeper, get more examples, or explore the full documentation.
Oh yeah, there's tons more detail available.
Definitely. Please do check out all the links we've put in the description. They'll point you towards the official UiPath documentation, more info on Studio itself, and also the UiPath Academy, which has fantastic learning resources.
The Academy is a great place to learn.
Absolutely. So keep exploring, keep building, keep automating, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.